In the last episode, I looked at the operational level for the Battle of Kiev on the eastern side of the Dnieper River. From that, I conclude that the Russians didn't have enough forces allocated to either encircle the city or seize the eastern side of the city in the face of organized resistance, even if everything had gone according to plan. This leaves two viable possible goals on the part of the Russians for the Battle of Kiev. Either they assumed little resistance, or this was intended as a feint. To begin with, I need to explain what the words assumed and feint mean to a military staff, as these are both terms of art with a lot of nuance and implications behind them. When people hear the phrase, the Russians assumed the Ukrainians wouldn't offer organized resistance, they're probably thinking in the colloquial sense. That is, that an assumption is a form of logical error or fallacy. Within military planning, assumptions are an extremely vital step whereby they are explicitly stated and then accepted by a specific authority. If the assumptions are rejected, then the planning cycle needs to start again. And if the assumptions are accepted, then the authority who accepted the assumption becomes responsible for the negative outcomes of those assumptions proving incorrect. Finally, assumptions are used to set the borders of a plan and allow for the creation of contingency plans or branch plans, rather than have the main plan become bogged down in following what-if rabbit holes. Let me try and make this clearer through an example. In this scenario, Canada has deployed a battle group to our ally Greyland in order to help them repulse an invasion by Lemgo. The battle group has been ordered to cross Jam Tart, seize Objective Rat, and then secure Jelly Fritter. The battle group commander completes his plan and then briefs his brigade commander. At the beginning of the briefing, the battle group commander states three assumptions. First, since south of Jam Tart is the Greyland Forces area of operation, they have already secured the bridges over Jam Tart and will continue to hold them throughout the operation. Second, as Greyland will be to the battle group's rear, it's acceptable to hand over any Lemgo prisoners of war to the Greyland forces. Thirdly, friendly forces will be able to maintain at least air parity throughout the operation. In this case, the assumption regarding the bridges can be accepted by the liaison officer from the Greyland forces. The assumption regarding prisoner of war handling would need to be accepted by the brigade's legal officer. Both of these assumptions revolve around things that friendly forces can or cannot do, so you can get a definitive answer about them. The reason they exist is because without the assumptions, the battle group commander would need to allocate significant resources to those tasks, meaning he needs reinforcement, needs a longer timeline to conduct the operation, or is going to decrease his combat power for the main task. However, regarding the question of air superiority, there's always the issue of the enemy getting a vote, and it being rather dangerous to make assumptions about what the enemy is going to do. Therefore, at this particular briefing, the Air Force liaison officer is not willing to accept the assumption. He states it's likely there'll be at least air parity, but the Lemgo Air Force still maintains the capability of having local air superiority for brief periods of time. The solution is for the assumption to be accepted with a contingency plan created in case the Lemgo Air Force manages to achieve local air superiority partway through the operation. As a result, the battle group's contingency plans officer will form a group to develop a plan that essentially says break glass in case of Lemgo Air Force showing up in large numbers. So at the end of the assumption stage, we know that if the battle group needs to fight to secure the bridges over Jam Tart, then it's the fault of the Greyland forces, who accepted the assumption. If there are delays due to some sort of Geneva Convention issue with handing over prisoners of war to Greyland, we'll know that it's the fault of the legal advisor for accepting that assumption. And in the event that Lemgo is able to achieve local air superiority, there's a contingency plan in place. An assumption being violated during the operation also acts as a trigger in that the original plan is no longer valid. Either a contingency plan needs to be implemented, or a new planning cycle needs to start. For instance, if the battle group is about to cross Jam Tart and they discover that a counterattack by Lemgo forces has pushed the Greyland troops off of the bridges, then the original operation is scrubbed. Either the battle group's mission needs to be delayed until a different unit manages to secure Jam Tart, or the battle group's new mission is to secure Jam Tart and then reassess whether or not the seizure of Objective Rat and securing Jelly Fritter is still possible. I've seen from several sources that the Russian intelligence services, during the planning stages, were very confident in their statement that Ukraine would not offer long-term organized resistance to the invasion. Assuming this is correct, within the military planning system that every staff officer learns at Staff College, this doesn't mean that you just hand-wave away the issue. If the invasion was predicated on the intelligence service's prediction of minimal resistance, then at some point there would have been a briefing by the armed forces to Vladimir Putin, where they would have stated Ukraine offering minimal organized resistance as an assumption. The intelligence services then would have had to accept responsibility for that assumption in front of the national leadership, so that, as it turned out to be the case, the Ukrainian army did stand and fight. The military leadership wouldn't be responsible for the failures flowing from that assumption. Furthermore, since this is an assumption regarding the enemy's intention or actions, it would have led to contingency planning. A separate team would have been formed to look at the issue of, what do we do if we can't seize the key junction towns on the east bank of the Dnieper River within the first 72 hours of the conflict? Or, what do we do if we reach the outskirts of Kiev and the Ukrainian army is still offering a significant and organized resistance? If something then occurred in the course of the invasion to prove that the assumption was false, that contingency plan would be dusted off, quickly adapted to the current circumstances, and new orders would be issued. If you want a historical example of this happening, Operation Barbarossa made an assumption the Bolshevik state would collapse if the Wehrmacht managed to destroy the Red Army in the West within 6 weeks. And consequently, when the Wehrmacht managed to destroy the Red Army in the West within 6 weeks, but the Bolshevik state did not collapse, this led to a new planning cycle, at which point Operation Barbarossa became Operation Typhoon. Of course, the amount of resources that a military staff will give to the main plan versus a contingency plan is going to vary based on their confidence in the assumptions underlying the main plan. It's all very well for the intelligence services back in Moscow to say they're confident the Ukrainians won't fight, but it's the army that has to do the actual job of blitzing down a couple of highways with less than a third of the troops that all of your staff education tells you need in order to accomplish the task set out in front of you. I hope you can see with just a rudimentary understanding of human nature why the Russian army, which had to actually do the task, was likely to put a rather large emphasis on any contingency planning of what to do in the event that Ukraine did offer the kind of resistance it actually did. Next, we come to the question of what is a feint? According to NATO doctrine, a feint is offensive action to deceive the enemy in order to have them commit resources to the battle incorrectly. One way of thinking of a feint is that it's halfway between a deception operation and a fixing operation. Deception operations are psychological rather than involving physical fighting, things like false radio transmissions, documents planted on corpses, etc., where the goal is to convince the enemy of a false piece of information in a way that's to your advantage. On the other side, you have fixing the enemy. That's the example of fighting in a dark cellar that I used, where you grab a hold of the opponent's shirt so that they can't run away. There's no deception involved here. It's purely about kinetic force. The enemy's aware that they've entered a kill zone. They want to get out of the kill zone, but they can't because their heads are pinned down by fire. A feint is sort of partway in between. It's partially a psychological operation to trick the enemy in some way, but like a fixing operation, it involves kinetic force to put the enemy in a position where they feel they must commit resources to a certain location, even though they don't want to. All of this is to say that at the operational level, the relationship between a plan assuming minimal organized enemy resistance versus contingency planning for things like a feint or a fixing operation is a lot more dynamic and fluid than you'd expect. Staff planning isn't about predicting the outcome of battles, as that's really impossible. It's about cognitively mapping out the battle space in a way that you can react agilely to an unfolding chaotic situation. That being said, we're still left with the question of what was the intention of the Russian armed forces in terms of the Kiev battle at the outset of the conflict. The short answer is I don't know, and I think it'll take something like 30 to 50 years before we find out the right answer. However, it's my best educated guess that even if the intelligence services assumed there would be limited Ukrainian resistance, either it was planned all along as a feint, or the army implemented the plan as a feint, or very quickly shifted to a contingency plan based on one. The most common argument I've heard against the Kiev battle being a feint is pointing to the involvement of the Russian Airborne Forces, the VDV, or the large number of troops that were committed to the Kiev battle. Let's look at the number of troops involved first. Obviously, I've outlined in some detail that the overall numbers committed to Kiev were not nearly sufficient. However, let's look at them as a ratio versus the other objectives. The Russian invasion consisted of advances on Kiev through the Chernobyl exclusion zone, south through Chernihiv, and southwest out of Kursk, then a push towards the Dnieper River in the center of the country, centered on Cherkasy, the encirclement of the bulk of Ukraine's pre-war standing army through fixing attacks out of the Donetsk and then flanking attacks meeting for an encirclement around Zaporizhia, and then the establishment of a land bridge through Crimea and an advance on Odessa. Using the same high estimate for the number of Russian forces involved, we find that approximately 29% of Russian troops were committed to the Kiev battle, but the Donbass area received 46% of Russian and affiliated separatist forces. On their own, these numbers suggest that Donbass was clearly the main effort of the Russian army. However, that amount of 29% in the Kiev area seems too high at first glance for merely a feint. However, let's compare this to probably the most famous feint in military history. For the 1940 German invasion of France, Army Group C was tasked with holding the Maginot Line, bordered directly with France. They had 22% of the German divisions committed. Army Group B advanced through Belgium and the Netherlands, which was itself merely meant to draw the French and British reserves into these two countries. That is, it was the feint force. It consisted of 32% of the German divisions. Meanwhile, Army Group A, which fought its way through the Ardennes and then advanced to the sea, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force, was 46% of the German divisions. Therefore, in both France in 1940 and Ukraine in February 2022, the decisive main effort was given 46% of troops available, and the German feint of invading through Belgium and Holland was given slightly more as a percentage of German forces than the Russians appear to have committed to the Kiev battle, at 32 versus 29%. Therefore, I would say that the percentage of forces allocated is not conclusive, but it does point towards the Kiev battle being intended as a feint. On the question of the deployment of so many Russian airborne troops around Kiev, I think that's really a wash in terms of determining whether the Kiev battle was a feint or based on an assumption of minimal Ukrainian resistance. Arguing against it being a feint, it is true that the Russian airborne forces have a higher level of training, motivation, and readiness than the rest of the Russian armed forces. The Russian airborne forces have historically also been used for political level or strategic objectives, such as being the group to quickly re-establish communist control in Eastern Europe several times during the Cold War. However, the Russian airborne troops are also the forces that require the least in terms of supplies to operate. The units are smaller, they have considerably less heavy equipment, and they operate out of a lighter armored vehicle, therefore requiring a lot less in terms of fuel to keep running. Given the transportation infrastructure issues through the Chernobyl exclusion zone, without knowing anything about objectives, you would expect that the airborne forces would be committed to this area, simply because they're the ones that are capable of operating on a leaner supply line. Furthermore, airborne forces are very often used for feints precisely because they are a bright, shiny object to dangle in front of the enemy. With France in 1940 as an example, all of the German airborne assets were used against Belgium and Holland. None of them were used for the breakout from the Ardennes region by Army Group A. So at this point, if I had some sort of scale, it would be leaning very slightly towards the feint side of the equation. However, somewhat jokingly, but not really, I'll come down with the opinion that the Battle of Kiev was intended as a feint simply because the Institute for the Study of War was so insistent that Kiev was Russia's main objective in February of 2022. The Institute for the Study of War is the most commonly cited expert source by the mainstream media for understanding the Ukraine war. However, they are a spin-off think tank for the Project for the New American Century. Looking through their daily updates for the first few months of the war, a couple of things are striking. Number one, they appear to be wrong about everything in hindsight. Number 2, up until March 25th, the daily updates included mapping the size and location and names of the various Russian units, with these map symbols suggesting that the bulk of Russian forces were committed to the Kiev area. On the 25th, the head of the Russian armed forces gave a press conference where he claimed that the main effort had always been in the Donetsk area, rather than around Kiev. The next day's update was emphatic that this claim was false, and that Russia's main goal had always been the seizure of Kiev. However, the same day, they removed the Russian unit symbols from their map, implying they were no longer confident that the bulk of Russian forces actually were deployed around Kiev. Given that everything I know about terrain, the operational level of war, Russian doctrine, the staff planning process, and Russian capabilities points towards the Kiev operation being more likely to be a feint, let's say I come down on that side of the issue, though I certainly wouldn't bet any significant amount of my own money on that being correct. So that brings us to the end of my analysis of the Battle of Kiev at the operational level. In the next episode, we'll zoom into the tactical level, looking at the Battle of Chernihiv, as interestingly, almost that entire battle was caught on free high-resolution satellite imagery. And looking at that imagery with the right eyes and background knowledge provides some fascinating insight into how near-peer warfare functions in a contemporary setting at the brigade and divisional levels. So now we're going to examine the Battle of Chernihiv from the tactical level. Now, as we discussed in the last episode, Chernihiv is a key rail and road junction town northwest of Kiev that the Russians nearly surrounded but weren't able to take. This is largely because Chernihiv was the home garrison to one of the two regular force tank brigades in the Ukrainian army, the 1st Tank Brigade. As such, they were in a much better position in terms of their state of mobilization and their level of training at the outset of the war than the overwhelming majority of the Ukrainian army. So the 1st Tank Brigade fought a covering force battle from the border back to a main defensive area that they'd established slightly outside of the outskirts of the city of Chernihiv. By the end of the first day, the Russian army had reached the outskirts of Chernihiv. The Russians made a small attempt to penetrate the city in the northeast near the airport, and then a much larger attempt to encircle the city down in the south that involved an assault river crossing around D+10, that is the 10th day of the war. However, the Russians were unable to cut the final road line supplying the city, or to take the main highways or rail lines through and around the city. So let's look in a bit more detail at the covering force battle. This is something undertaken by a highly mobile force that conducts a fighting withdrawal, during which their goals are to attrit the enemy, to shape them, that is, to have them arrive within the main defensive area at the location and time that's preferred by the defenders, and to delay, that is, to fight to buy time for further entrenchment at the main defensive area. Ukraine clearly had a demolition plan, because at the beginning of the conflict, they demolished a bridge and 2 highway overpasses to render this short route into the city of Chernihiv from the Belarusian border, where it dips down along the Dnieper River here, unusable by the invading Russian forces. They also demolished the main bridge over the Dniester River outside of Chernihiv. The effect of this was to force the Russian invaders to advance on Chernihiv the long way up from the north, and to then either have to do an assault river crossing of the Dniester River or fight their way through the city of Chernihiv. Because besides the bridges in the middle of the city, the nearest bridges over the Dniester River are 80 and 100 kilometers away. Therefore, the obstacles and demolition plan had the effect of creating a natural block along the Dniester River. The 1st Ukrainian Tank Brigade then concentrated most of its forces along this highway, which is now the shortest viable route into Chernihiv in terms of ambushes and fighting withdrawals. On this map, I've charted the locations where you can see destroyed vehicles or ambush sites as red circles with white X's, and you can see just how much they're concentrated along that main highway, the M01. This forced the Russians to take the longer, less direct route through the side roads. This delayed the Russians, but much more importantly, it lengthened their convoy routes, which was especially important given that 150-kilometer range of the MTO brigades that we discussed as a weakness of the Russian logistics system in the last episode. Now we're going to take a virtual tour down the M01 Highway from the Belarusian border to the city of Chernihiv. The first 30 kilometers past the border consist of dense forest that could have been good defensive terrain, but it doesn't appear the Ukrainians were in position to take advantage of this. The first sign of combat is these two destroyed vehicles on a railway overpass near the village of Rybki. It was unclear whether they're Russian or Ukrainian. 200 meters down the road, the track marks show the Russians conducted a react to ambush drill where they spread off from the road, but there's no destroyed equipment. There's really just some shelling and signs of reconnaissance elements pausing to check things out until we get to about 15 kilometers outside of Chernihiv. There's a small village here where a Russian armored company is ambushed by a slightly smaller Ukrainian tank unit. There's a lot of jockeying, and then it appears a second, at least company-sized Russian element flanks the village around to the right to get onto this parallel road. However, they run into an ambush by the next town, and there's track marks showing at least a company, more likely 2 or 3 companies, jockeying for quite some time in order to provide fire into that town. And you can see track marks where the Ukrainian tanks use this row of houses in order to jockey and engage in fire with the Russians. Back on the highway, there's another wrecked armored vehicle, and then tank tracks showing jockeying by the Russians. 1,700 meters forward, not coincidentally, the ideal engagement range for the T-64 tanks, the Ukrainian 1st Tank Brigade, we find tracks showing where the Ukrainians jockeyed to engage in fire with the Russian tanks. The Russian main body on the M01 Highway seems to have then advanced up to this second town, which I'm not going to try to pronounce, and provided fire support along the left flank while the Ukrainians withdrew. By the end of this sequence, the Russians were now 11 kilometers from Chernihiv. The next couple of kilometers show an absolute mess of jockeying sites, burnt-out vehicles, signs of shell explosions, signs of missile hits, all of which show that along the M01 highway for this stretch, the Russians were ambushed frequently. Very frequently. In the previous episode, I talked about the Highway of Death not really living up to its reputation according to what I could see from the satellite imagery. That's not the case here. Clearly, the Russians had a very difficult time going down this stretch of road. There's a lot of Ukrainian tank jockeying tracks in this village of Rivnopilya, which is the last village on the M1 highway before the outskirts of Chernihiv, so it makes sense that this is where they made their stand. On the outskirts of the village, there's also the wreck of a Russian tank. After fighting their way through the next village, they were ambushed by a either tank or mechanized infantry platoon that was establishing a roadblock in the middle of this small forest. What looks like a Russian company attempted to flank around to the right, but after getting onto the auxiliary road, they again encountered another mechanized or tank platoon and had to fight a jockeying battle while the Ukrainians withdrew into the city of Chernihiv. The platoon that established the roadblock in the middle of the small forest appears to have been completely destroyed. Moving down the M01 highway again, it appears the Russian convoy took fire from this farm on the left. As a result, there's a burnt-out vehicle and signs of a lot of shelling of the area. There's then a further sign of an ambush site and then jockeying at the outskirts of Chernihiv, where again we see a number of burnt-out Ukrainian vehicles. At this location on the outskirts of town, the Ukrainians placed either a mechanized infantry or tank platoon to block entry to the city. As there's no signs of any fighting by the Russians in depth past this roadblock, it appears they are successful, though all the Ukrainian vehicles were destroyed. So what is it we learned from taking this tour of the M01 Highway? Here's a highlight of the M01 Highway, showing all the notations for the various encounter battles and ambushes that took place on this highway. Now what's obvious is the enormous contrast in terms of activity for the next highway over to the right. This is a much less direct route into the city from the Belarusian border, and therefore the Ukrainians paid much less attention to this during the covering force battle. The other major advance on Chernihiv was done by a column traveling down the P13 Highway. The satellite imagery starts about 10 kilometers outside of the city limits of Chernihiv, where the tank tracks show us that a Ukrainian armored company fought an encounter battle against what looks to be a Russian battalion tactical group outside the village of Stasi. Both sides appear to have lost a number of tanks, but then the tank tracks shows that the Russians were able to occupy the same area used by the Ukrainian tank company and then advance closer towards Chernihiv. Just past the main battle, you can see jockeying position from what seems to be another Ukrainian tank platoon, which again would have been the break clean force to allow the company to withdraw. You then see a number of encounter battle positions as the Russians flanked to the right, which in this case would be west, in order for them to eventually link up with the other Russian column that was advancing down the M01 highway. It appears Ukrainian tank company or tank platoon counterattacked out of this set of warehouses, which may have also been strong-pointed by infantry, but the tracks show the Russians were able to sweep through this area and continue east towards the M01 Highway. The satellite images captured a number of burning vehicles, but I'm unable to tell which side they're from. Therefore, we appear to have one battalion tactical group whose task was to go around the western side of the city in order to link up with the force pushing down the M01 Highway. A second battalion tactical group flanked left in order to get onto the P12 Highway. You can see where there's a brief encounter battle with the Ukrainian platoon holding the tree line here on the edge of this group of woods. They appear to have withdrawn fairly quickly, and the Russians push past the woods, but about 50 meters past the wood line, the Russian column halts and then withdraws in order to begin their left flanking maneuver down the P13 Highway. The woods in this area are in a C shape, which is the perfect location for an L-shaped ambush. Therefore, it's likely that the Russian column sighted Ukrainian forces prior to entering the kill zone and was able to avoid the ambush. Having avoided an ambush on the direct route down the P13 Highway, the battalion tactical group flanked left down side roads in order to access the P12 Highway. The tracks here show a Ukrainian platoon engaging at about 2 kilometers out from what seems to be about a company of Russian vehicles, while the remainder of the battalion tactical group continues down this road with a left flanking maneuver. This group of large buildings just past the Ukrainian jockeying positions appears to have been fortified by infantry, and consequently it received a lot of Russian indirect and direct fire. After this set of buildings, the Russians had reached the outskirts of Chernihiv, so this second column has managed to both reach the outskirts and make contact with the column advancing down the M01 Highway. This effectively brings the covering force battle stage to an end. So how successful were the Ukrainians at this covering force battle? Well, as we discussed at the beginning, the three goals of a covering force battle are to attrit the enemy, to shape them, and to cause a delay. Now, it's clear from the number of road ambushes and burning vehicles that they were able to inflict significant attrition. This also resulted in the Russians using the less direct roads in order to advance on the city, meaning they also succeeded at shaping the enemy. However, there's reports from both the Ukrainian and the Russian side that the advance of these two columns managed to reach the outskirts of Chernihiv within the first 24 hours of the conflict. So we would have to say they failed their goal of delaying the Russian advance. Having completed the covering force battle, the Russians spent about the next 2 weeks attacking the main defensive area around Chernihiv, both in attempts to fight into the city and an encirclement attempt that included an assault river crossing. However, we're now approaching 30 minutes for this episode, and so we'll have to wait for the next episode to do a battlefield tour for the main defensive battle portion for the Siege of Chernihiv.